6 months before this morning, the man on this bridge gave the order that destroyed Pearl Harbor. 2,400 Americans died that Sunday. He has not lost a battle since. In 4 minutes, he will lose everything. His name is Nagumo Chuichi. The date is June 4th, 1942. The clock on the bridge of the carrier Akagi reads 10:24 in the morning. And somewhere in the high sky above him, an American Navy pilot named Wade McCluskey has just looked down through a break in the clouds and seen the entire Imperial Japanese fleet spread beneath his wings. McCluskey does not hesitate. He pushes the nose of his dauntless dive bomber straight down. What happens in the next 6 minutes will end the Pacific War before it has finished beginning. But the story does not begin in the sky above the Akagi. It begins 3,000 miles away in a basement office in Hawaii, where a man in carpet slippers was about to change the course of the Pacific War with a lie about drinking water. But the story does not begin on the Akagi. It begins 3,000 miles away in a basement office in Hawaii, where a man in carpet slippers was about to change the course of the Pacific War with a lie about drinking water. The Imperial Japanese Navy in the spring of 1942 was a navy that had forgotten how to lose. For 6 months it had moved across the Pacific and Indian Oceans like a god of war. Pearl Harbor in December, the destruction of Force Z off Malaya, where the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse went to the bottom in a single afternoon. The Java Sea, Rabaul, Singapore, the carrier raid into the Indian Ocean that drove the British Royal Navy out of Ceylon. Every operation had succeeded. Every enemy had been broken. The architect of this storm was a man who had never wanted it. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, a small man with the missing fingers of an old wound from the Russo-Japanese War, a face that smiled easily, and eyes that did not smile at all. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, from Harvard 1919-1921. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had driven across America in the 1920s and seen the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pittsburgh. He had warned his government again and again that war with the United States was a war Japan could not win. When they ordered him to plan it anyway, he obeyed, and he planned it brilliantly, but Pearl Harbor had missed the prize. The American aircraft carriers had been at sea on December 7th. Yamamoto knew this was a wound, not a kill. He told his staff that he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, before American industry crushed him. After that, no one could predict. 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The damage was minimal. The humiliation was total. The Doolittle raid told Yamamoto that his 6 months were almost gone. He needed a decisive battle. He needed to find the American carriers and destroy them on the open sea. He drew his trap on a chart of the Central Pacific. The bait would be Midway Atoll, 2 specks of coral and sand 2,000 miles west of Honolulu, an outpost the Americans could not afford to lose. Japan would attack it. The Americans would rush to defend it. And waiting for them north and west of the atoll would be 4 fleet carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and almost 200 warships in total, the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. It was an elegant plan. It depended on one assumption, that the Americans would not know they were coming. In a windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, that assumption was already a corpse. The room was called the dungeon. The men who worked there called themselves Station Hypeo. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, 41 years old, a thin man with sunken eyes who wore a smoking jacket over his uniform and slippers on his feet because his feet hurt. He had not been outside in daylight for weeks. He slept on a cot in the office. He survived on coffee and sandwiches that his wife sent over and that he often forgot to eat. Rochefort spoke Japanese. He had served in Tokyo in the 1930s. He had spent 15 years inside the Japanese Naval Code, working at it the way a stonecutter works at granite. The code was called JN-25. It was a 5-digit super-encipherment system, and it was supposed to be unbreakable. It was not unbreakable. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts and linguists were reading something between 15% of the messages they intercepted. They were not reading them in real time. They were reading them 3 to 5 days late, in fragments, in guesses, in flashes of pattern recognition that came after weeks of staring at columns of numbers. In May, the fragments began to align. A target identified only as AF, a date in early June. Surface forces, carrier forces, an invasion force. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. The Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington believed AF was somewhere else. Possibly the Aleutians, possibly the west coast of the United States, possibly Hawaii itself. Admiral Chester Nimitz, 57 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had to choose between them. If Rochefort was right and Washington was wrong, Midway might still be defended. If Washington was right and Rochefort was wrong, Nimitz would have stripped his force from the wrong ocean and lost the war in a week. He chose Rochefort, but he wanted to be sure. The trick was simple. It was also the simplest trap in the history of naval intelligence. On Rochefort's recommendation, the garrison at Midway was instructed to send an uncoded radio message back to Pearl Harbor. The message reported that the atoll's saltwater distillation plant had broken down. The garrison was running short of fresh water. Please advise, it was a lie. The water plant was fine. The message was sent in the clear on a frequency the Japanese were known to monitor. Then Station Hippo waited. 2 days later, a Japanese intercept arrived at the dungeon. It was decrypted at speed. The intercept reported that AF was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. Rochefort read the decrypt and did not smile. He simply walked it upstairs. Admiral Nimitz now knew beyond any reasonable doubt that AF was Midway. He knew the approximate date. He knew the axis of approach. He knew the composition of the Japanese striking force. The Imperial Japanese Navy was sailing toward a trap. They believed the trap was theirs. It was not. The man who would walk into that trap first was Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, 55 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Naval Academy in 1908. 40 years at sea, he was not an aviator. He was a torpedo specialist, an expert in destroyers and surface gunnery. His entire career had been built around the doctrine of the battle line, the night attack, the torpedo salvo at close range. Aviation to him was a tool used by other men, and yet here he was in command of the most powerful carrier strike force in the world. The First Air Fleet, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 248 aircraft, the same air crews who had hit Pearl Harbor, the same machine that had ranged across half the world without losing a single carrier. Nagumo had not asked for the command. Yamamoto had given it to him because of seniority, because Japanese naval tradition demanded it, because the men who actually understood carrier warfare were too junior to lead a fleet. He was a careful officer placed in charge of a weapon that rewarded aggression. He knew it. His staff knew it. Yamamoto knew it. His chief of staff was Rear Admiral Kusaka Ryunosuke, 49 years old, also a surface officer. The air operations officer was Commander Genda Minoru, 37 years old, the brilliant young architect of the Pearl Harbor air plan. As the fleet sailed east toward Midway, Genda lay in his bunk with pneumonia, burning with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness. The strike leader who had led the planes over Pearl Harbor, Captain Fuchida Mitsuo, 39 years old, had collapsed with appendicitis on May 30th. The ship's surgeon had opened him on the wardroom table. Fuchida would watch the Battle of Midway from a stretcher. 2 of the 3 men who understood carrier aviation best in the Imperial Japanese Navy were sick. The third was Nagumo, and he was not one of them. In the next division, on the carrier Hiryu, was Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, 50 years old, Princeton-trained, having studied there from 1921 to 1923. Aggressive, intelligent, beloved by his junior officers. Many in the Navy believed Yamaguchi should have been commanding Kido Butai instead of Nagumo. Yamaguchi believed it too, though he was too disciplined to say so. He commanded Carrier Division 2. Hiryu and Soryu, 2 carriers under his flag. He was younger than Nagumo, lower in rank, and he was about to spend the next 24 hours watching a battle slip away from a commander who could not see it slipping. 300 miles to the west, on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto himself rode the operation forward. Yamato was the largest warship ever built, 72,000 tons, 18-inch guns, a floating monument to the doctrine of the battleship. She had been finished 4 months earlier. She had never fired her guns in anger, and never would, because the world she had been built for was already gone, and her builder did not yet know it. Yamamoto was ill that morning, stomach pains, a low fever. His staff, Officer Watanabe Yasuji, 47 years old, and his chief planner Kuroshima Kamito, 49 years old, hovered around him. Communications were maintained by radio, sparingly, and only in carefully coded bursts. The whole operation depended on radio silence. The whole operation depended on the Americans not knowing. The Americans knew everything. Northeast of Midway, in a patch of empty ocean the Japanese search planes would never quite reach, 3 American aircraft carriers waited. Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. The Yorktown was the impossible one. She had been hit at the Battle of the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier. A bomb had punched through her flight deck and detonated 4 decks down. Japanese intelligence reported her sunk. American intelligence reported her requiring 3 months of repair. She made it back to Pearl Harbor on May 27th. Admiral Nimitz walked into the dry dock himself, in shirt sleeves with the water still draining around her hull, and asked the yard superintendent how long he needed. 3 months, the superintendent said. You have 3 days, Nimitz said. Approximately 1,400 yard workers swarmed the ship. They worked in shifts that did not end. They welded over holes they could not properly repair. They patched what could not be replaced. They flooded compartments with concrete. On May 30th, smoke still curling from her stack, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor under her own power. She steamed northeast at 25 knots, joining Task Force 17, joining the trap. When Nagumo's scouts swept the ocean ahead of the strike force, they were searching for 2 American carriers, because the third one was supposed to be at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The third one was waiting for him. In overall tactical command of the American carriers was Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, 56 years old, aboard Yorktown. Below him, commanding Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet, was a man who had not been Nimitz's first choice. Vice Admiral William Halsey, 59 years old, the most aggressive carrier commander in the United States Navy, had been hospitalized with severe shingles. The disease covered his body in painful sores. He could not walk to the bridge. From his hospital bed, he was asked who should take his place. Halsey gave one name, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, 55 years old, a surface officer, a cruiser commander, a man with no carrier experience whatsoever. Spruance was the opposite of Halsey, quiet, methodical, almost monkish. He read books. He took long walks. He did not raise his voice. He had been Halsey's screen commander, escorting the carriers with cruisers and destroyers. Now he would command them. The Japanese knew Halsey. They had built their entire psychological assessment of American carrier tactics around Halsey. They did not know Spruance. They were about to meet him. On the night of June 3rd, the last night of the old Pacific War, Nagumo Chuichi sat in his cabin aboard the Akagi and reviewed the operational orders one final time. His scouts would sweep ahead. His strike force would hit Midway at dawn. The Americans, if they came at all, would come later, possibly days later, possibly never. There was no carrier within 500 miles of his position. Intelligence had assured him of this. He was a careful man. He had always been a careful man. His doctrine told him that surprise was on his side. His staff told him that surprise was on his side. The reports from Combined Fleet Headquarters told him that surprise was on his side. He went to bed before midnight. 300 miles behind him, Yamamoto lay in his cabin on the Yamato, feverish and uneasy, listening to the deep hum of the battleship's engines, waiting for a victory that was already lost. 3,000 miles east, in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort sat at his desk in his slippers and his smoking jacket, reading the latest intercepts, looking for the final confirmation of Nagumo's position. And 400 miles northeast of Midway, in the gathering twilight of the Central Pacific, 3 American aircraft carriers turned their bows into the wind and waited. The bait was set, the hunters were positioned. The trap that Yamamoto Asaroku had drawn on his chart, the trap that would lure the American fleet to its destruction, the trap that would end the Pacific War in Japan's favor and force Washington to the negotiating table, the trap that represented the entire strategic future of the Empire of Japan, was about to spring. It would spring on the people who set it. And in the darkness above the Pacific, a single Japanese floatplane sat on the catapult of the cruiser Tone, waiting for the order to launch at dawn. Its catapult was malfunctioning. It would not be discovered until morning. The plane would launch 30 minutes late. Those 30 minutes would cost the Empire of Japan the war. 4:30 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. The eastern horizon was a thin red wound. The sea was black. On the flight decks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the engines of 108 aircraft roared into the pre-dawn dark. Blue exhaust flames stuttered from cowlings. Deck crews crouched against the wind of the propellers, wedge chocks in their hands, eyes streaming. The strike leader was Lieutenant Tomonaga Yoichi, 31 years old, a career naval aviator from Hiryu. He was a careful pilot, well-liked, the father of a young son in Tokyo. His aircraft, a Type 97 attack bomber, was the first to lift off. Then Kaga, then Akagi, then Soryu. In 20 minutes, the entire strike was airborne, climbing in formation through the rose-colored air, turning southeast toward Midway Atoll, 240 miles away. On the bridge of the Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi watched them disappear. The deck below him was already being respotted for the second wave. 93 aircraft, held in reserve, armed for ships, torpedoes slung under the bellies of the Nakajima B-5N attack bombers. 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs hung beneath the Aichi dive bombers. These were the weapons that killed warships. They were the insurance policy. They were the reason Nagumo had divided his force. If American carriers appeared, he could hit them within 30 minutes. There would be no American carriers. Intelligence had assured him. He went below for breakfast. At 7 o'clock, the radio operator on the Akagi handed Nagumo a flimsy. The message was from Tomonaga, returning from Midway. 3 short sentences. The first wave had hit the atoll. They had destroyed buildings, fuel tanks, hangars. They had not destroyed the airfield. The runways were still intact. American aircraft had already gotten airborne before the attack. Tomonaga's report ended with a single phrase that pressed itself into Nagumo's chest like a thumb. There is need for a second attack wave. Nagumo read the words twice. His jaw tightened. He looked at Rear Admiral Kusaka Ryunosuke, his chief of staff. He looked at the air staff officers around him. He did not need to ask their opinion. Their opinion was already in their faces. The atoll was not dead. The atoll had teeth. They would be coming. Nagumo gave the order at 7:15. Re-arm the reserve strike, land attack bombs. Prepare for a second strike on Midway. In the hangar decks 4 levels below the bridge, the order came down like a hammer. Ordnance handlers stared at each other for a single second. Then they moved. The torpedoes that had been slung beneath the B-5N attack bombers, the precious Type 91 torpedoes designed for one purpose, to break the back of an enemy carrier, were uncoupled by hand. Each weapon weighed nearly 2,000 pounds. They were rolled across the steel deck on hand trolleys, back into the magazine storage racks. 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs were unbolted from the Aichi dive bombers and replaced with 250-kilogram general-purpose bombs. It was careful work. It was slow work. It could not be rushed. Below the waterline, in cramped spaces filled with the smell of cordite and aviation fuel, hundreds of men worked at a pace that would have terrified any safety officer in any other navy in the world. It would take an hour to complete. It was the longest hour in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The scout plane from the heavy cruiser Tone should have been in the air at 4:30. with the rest of the dawn reconnaissance sweep. It was not. Its catapult had malfunctioned. The aircraft was a Type 0 reconnaissance floatplane. Its pilot was Petty Officer First Class Amari Hiroshi. He sat in the cockpit while machinists worked on the catapult mechanism. 5 minutes passed, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. When Amari finally launched at 5 o'clock, the rest of the search arc was already in the air ahead of him. His sector was the one closest to the American position, the single most critical sector in the entire reconnaissance plan. He arrived in his search area 30 minutes late. If he had arrived on time, he would have seen the American carriers before Nagumo launched the Midway strike. The entire battle would have unfolded differently. Nagumo would have launched his ship-killing strike first thing in the morning. The Pacific War might have ended in a Japanese victory at Midway. He did not arrive on time. He flew south at 4,000 feet, scanning the empty sea. At 7:28, Amari's radio came alive. He had spotted 10 surface ships, bearing 210 degrees from Midway, distance 240 miles. Course 150, speed 20 knots. The message reached the Akagi at 7:45. The bridge fell silent. 10 ships, no mention of carriers. Nagumo stared at the chart. His staff stared at the chart. American carriers were not supposed to be there. American carriers were not supposed to be anywhere within 500 miles. If those 10 ships were a screen, there might be heavier units behind them. If those 10 ships were a transport convoy, there might be no carriers at all. He needed to know what was in that contact. Below decks, the reserve strike was halfway rearmed. Torpedoes were back in magazines. Land attack bombs were already mounted on some aircraft. Others still hung empty. Nagumo gave the order at 7:45. Suspend the rearming. Hold, await further information. In the hangar decks, the work stopped. Ordnance handlers wiped their faces and waited. For 24 minutes, the most powerful naval strike force in the world drifted between two purposes: half-armed for ships, half-armed for land, capable of neither attack at full strength. At 8:09, Amari's second message reached the Akagi. The composition of the enemy force appears to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo read it. He exhaled, no carriers. He gave the order to resume rearming for the Midway strike. The hangar deck crews started moving again. Torpedoes back out of magazines. Land attack bombs onto aircraft. It was the wrong order. It would always be the wrong order. The Tone Scout had counted wrong. The American force in that sector was Task Force 16, 2 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, with their screen. Amari had missed the carriers under the cloud cover. 11 minutes later, at 8:20, the third message came in. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier, a single carrier. Nagumo read the words and felt the deck shift beneath him. There was now an American carrier within strike range. His reserve aircraft were once again being rearmed, this time for the wrong target. His own first strike was returning from Midway, 240 miles out, low on fuel, aircraft damaged, pilots wounded. The flight deck was a mess of fueled aircraft, scattered ordnance, fuel hoses, men running in every direction. He had 2 choices. He could launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, even though some still carried the wrong weapons, even though they would have no fighter escort because the Zeros were aloft on combat air patrol, even though it meant abandoning the Midway strike force to ditch in the ocean, or he could clear his decks, land Tomonaga's strike, properly rearm everything, refuel everything, launch one massive, coordinated, properly armed attack against the American carrier. A signal lamp began blinking from the Hidyu, 10 miles to the north. It was Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon. The message was 3 words long. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Nagumo read the lamp signal. His staff read it. His chief of staff Kusaka read it. Nagumo refused. His doctrine, his training, his entire 40-year career told him not to send a half-armed, unescorted, partial strike against an enemy carrier. He would clear his decks. He would do it properly. He gave the order to recover the Midway strike first. The hangar decks went into chaos. Below decks, In spaces never designed for what was being asked of them, men worked in a sea of fumes. Aircraft were being refueled where they sat, with bowsers and rubber hoses snaking across the steel plates. Ordnance was being changed for the fourth time in 3 hours. Torpedoes that had just been brought back up were being struck back down. Bombs that had been mounted were being taken off and stacked along the bulkheads because there was no time to return them to the magazines. Aviation fuel was everywhere. The Japanese carriers had been designed for speed and aircraft capacity, not survival. Their hangar decks were enclosed, with no provision for venting blast or fire. Their fire suppression systems were minimal. The damage control doctrine was decades behind the Americans. The Akagi at this moment was a floating bomb. So was the Kaga, so was the Soryu, and above them, in the rising light of mid-morning, the American carrier aircraft were already in the air. At 9:18, the first attack came in. It was Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, 41 years old, leading 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. The Devastator was obsolete, slow, lightly armored, carrying a torpedo that often did not work even when delivered correctly. Waldron knew it. His men knew it. They had written letters to their wives the night before. They came in low, wave-top altitude. No fighter escort. The Wildcats from Hornet had lost them in the clouds. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol saw them coming. 18 Zeros peeled out of the upper sky like falling knives. They cut Waldron's squadron apart in 8 minutes. 15 aircraft. 15 kills. Not a single torpedo found its mark. Of the 30 men in Torpedo 8, one survived. Ensign George Gay, 25 years old, ditched his burning Devastator and clung to a floating seat cushion in the middle of the Japanese fleet. He watched the rest of the battle from the water. He watched what came next. What came next was Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise. 14 Devastators. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. 12 Devastators. The Japanese Zeros killed them too. They killed almost all of them. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked Kido Butai that morning, 35 were destroyed. 80 men. None of the torpedoes hit. It was a slaughter. It was a victory. On the bridge of the Akagi, Nagumo's staff officers watched the dying American aircraft and allowed themselves to believe that the worst was over. They had broken 3 full torpedo squadrons. They had paid almost nothing for it. Their own strike was almost ready to launch. In another 15 minutes, possibly 20, the rearmed bombers would be lifting off the deck. But the dying American torpedo bombers had done something Nagumo's officers did not see. They had pulled every single Japanese Zero down to wave-top altitude. The combat air patrol that should have been guarding the upper sky was at sea level, chasing the last of the Devastators, climbing back up, refueling, rotating, repositioning. The high cover was empty, and out of the empty higher cover the bill came due. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, 40 years old, commanding the air group of the Enterprise, had been lost for 40 minutes. He had launched at the predicted Japanese position. The Japanese were not there. McCluskey had fuel for perhaps another hour. He had 33 dive bombers behind him. He could turn around and try to make it back to Enterprise. He could press on into empty ocean and hope. He chose to press on. At 9:55, he saw something on the surface of the sea, a single Japanese destroyer, alone, steaming north at high speed, drawing a white wake behind her. The Arashi. She had been left behind to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, 40 years old, which had stumbled into the Japanese fleet earlier that morning. Now Arashi was racing to rejoin Kido Butai. McCluskey understood instantly. He banked his squadron to follow the destroyer's course. The Arashi led him north for 30 minutes, oblivious to the death floating 6 miles above her at 14,000 feet. At 10:20, McCluskey looked down and saw, spread across the sea below him, the entire Japanese carrier force. 4 flight decks. Wakes curving across the ocean. Outlined against the blue, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The high sky was empty. McCluskey did something almost no commander would have done. He attacked, immediately. He picked the two nearest carriers, the Kaga and the Akagi, and rolled into a dive at 10:22. At the same moment, coming in from the southeast at 14,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, 39 years old, leading the Yorktown Dive Bomber Squadron, saw the Soryu beneath him. He rolled into a dive, too, two American squadrons, two different carriers, two different directions, the same minute, the same second. On the bridge of the Akagi, a lookout shouted, "Hell divers!" Nagumo turned. He looked up. Out of the high sky, against the white cloud, the silhouettes of dauntless dive bombers were already past the apex of their dives. Their dive brakes were open. They were screaming down at 300 miles an hour, almost vertical, growing larger every second. There was no time to do anything. The Zeros were at sea level. The anti-aircraft guns could not elevate fast enough. The carrier was steaming straight into the wind, in launch configuration, the worst possible posture. The first bomb missed. The second bomb missed. The third bomb did not miss. It was a 1,000-pound bomb, released by Lieutenant Richard Best, 32 years old, the executive officer of Bombing 6. Best had pulled out of his dive at the last possible moment, signaling his two wingmen, Lieutenant Edwin Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber, to follow him to the Akagi instead. He had brought 3 bombs to the flagship of the Pearl Harbor strike. His bomb came through the flight deck near the amidships elevator. It punched through the wooden deck planks and the thin steel beneath them. It went into the upper hangar. It detonated. The hangar at that moment was full of aircraft being rearmed for the 4th time, full of fuel lines, full of bombs stacked along the bulkheads, because there had been no time to return them to the magazines, full of torpedoes still in their racks. One bomb, one hit. The fire bloomed outward from the point of detonation and found the fueled aircraft, and the fueled aircraft found the loose ordnance, and the loose ordnance found the next aircraft. The flight deck of the Akagi heaved upward like a sheet of paper struck from below. Flames burst through the elevator wells. Fires raced through the hangar. Within 90 seconds, the Akagi was beyond saving. The Pearl Harbor flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy was dying. It had taken one bomb. The bomb did not kill her. 3 rearmings in 3 hours killed her. The fueled aircraft sitting wing to wing on a deck designed for speed, not survival. The loose ordnance stacked along the bulkheads. The fuel hoses. The 41 minutes Amari was late. The decision not to launch at 8:20. The decision not to listen to Yamaguchi. These were the things that killed the Akagi. The bomb only lit the fuse. He had a fine voice. As the Soryu listed, men in the water below could hear him singing Umi Yukaba, the old battle hymn of the Imperial Navy. A song about dying for the Emperor. A song about bodies in the grass and bodies in the sea. A mile away, the same thing was happening to the Kaga. McCluskey's main body had come down on her. 25 dive bombers. 4 bombs hit her in rapid succession. One detonated near the bridge and killed almost everyone in the command compartment, including the captain. Another smashed into a fueling cart on the flight deck and ignited a torrent of burning aviation fuel that ran down the deck like a river. The Kaga's hangar exploded outward. Burning aircraft poured from the elevator wells. Crew members leapt from the flight deck into the sea. She would burn for hours. 6 miles north, Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadron came down on the Soryu. 3 bombs hit her in less than 2 minutes. All 3 detonated in the hangar. The Soryu was the smallest of the 4, most fragile. Her boilers exploded. Her engines stopped. Her steering went dead. Within minutes, she was a drifting torch. Captain Yanagimoto Ryusaku, 47 years old, refused to leave his ship. He stood on the bridge as flames climbed around him and watched his crew abandon the carrier. He had a fine voice. As the Soryu listed, men in the water below could hear him singing Umi Yukaba, the old battle hymn of the Imperial Navy, a song about dying for the Emperor, a song about bodies in the grass and bodies in the sea. He went down with the ship. 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers of Kido Butai were finished. On the bridge of the Akagi, Nagumo Chuichi stood without moving. Smoke was already pouring up the side of the island. The deck below him was a sheet of fire. His communications were failing. His engineering spaces were filling with smoke. His staff officers were shouting at him to evacuate. He would not. His chief of staff, Kusaka, grabbed him by the arm. He spoke into Nagumo's face. The admiral had to live. The fleet still needed a commander. There was still Hiryu. There was still a battle. Nagumo did not move. Kusaka and another officer half-carried him to a window. They threw a rope down the side of the burning island. They forced him to climb out. Nagumo Chuichi, the victor of Pearl Harbor, the commander of the most powerful carrier strike force in the world, was lowered by rope from the burning bridge of his flagship at 10:46 on the morning of June 4, 1942. His face was wet, whether from smoke or tears or both. No one ever recorded. He transferred to the light cruiser Nagara. The Akagi burned behind him. 10 miles to the north, the Hiryu had escaped the dive bombers entirely. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon had watched 3 of his sister carriers die in 6 minutes. His ship was alone. He did not hesitate. At 10:58, 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters lifted off the deck of the Hiryu. They climbed eastward, hunting the American carriers. At noon, they found the Yorktown. They put 3 bombs into her. One destroyed her smokestack. Another knocked out her boilers. A third penetrated to her engineering spaces and started fires near her ammunition magazines. The Yorktown went dead in the water. Smoke poured from her stack. She listed slightly. The Hiryu's pilots flew home and reported a carrier sunk. Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 13:31. 10 torpedo bombers, 6 fighters. They found another American carrier underway, recovering aircraft. They put 2 torpedoes into her port side. She listed 17 degrees and lost all power. The Hiryu's pilots flew home and reported a second carrier sunk. There were only 2 American carriers, they believed. They had sunk both. The battle had been a victory after all. It had not been a victory. They had hit the Yorktown twice. She had been repaired between the attacks. They had thought she was a different carrier. There were still 2 undamaged American carriers in the area, the Enterprise and the Hornet, and they now knew exactly where Hiryu was. The Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers. At 5:03 in the afternoon, they came down on the Hiryu out of the western sun. 4 bombs hit her in less than a minute. The same chain reaction that had killed her sisters started in her hangar. Fueled aircraft, loose ordnance, fire. The Hiryu began to burn. By nightfall, all 4 carriers of Kido Butai were aflame on the dark Pacific. The strike force that had hit Pearl Harbor, that had run wild across 2 oceans for 6 months, that had been the spear point of an empire, was dying in the dark. 300 miles west, on the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku still did not understand the full scale of what had happened. He was about to. The Hiryu burned through the night. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon stood on the listing flight deck in the dark and looked at his ship. The fires below the hangar gave the night a red bottom, as if the sea itself were on fire. His face was streaked with soot. He was 50 years old. He had 3 hours to live. Around him, the surviving crew was being evacuated to destroyers. Yamaguchi had given the order. He had also given another order, quietly, to his chief of staff. 4 of his youngest staff officers were to leave the ship. They were not to argue. They were to carry his last letters home to their families. They were to live. He himself would not. Captain Kaku Tomio, 49 years old, the commanding officer of the Hiryu, would stay with him. The 2 men had decided this together earlier in the evening, without raising their voices. Before he left the bridge for the last time, Yamaguchi took off his admiral's cap and handed it to one of the departing officers. A gift, a memorial, a small thing in a dark place. He did one other thing. He sent a final radio message. It went to Vice Admiral Nagumo aboard the cruiser Nagara. In it, Yamaguchi took the full responsibility for the loss of his 2 carriers upon himself. He did not mention the rearming, or the refusal to launch, or the 41 minutes Amari was late. He simply accepted the blame as a divisional commander and asked that the fight continue. It was not the whole truth. The decisions that lost battle had not been his. He had been the one officer who tried to launch when launching mattered. He sent the message anyway. Nagumo received it. He did not reply. The gesture of one dying admiral covering for another would remain for decades after the war, almost unknown. Just before dawn on June 5th, the destroyer Makigumo fired a torpedo into the Hiryu. The carrier rolled over slowly and went down. Yamaguchi and Kaku went with her. 300 miles to the west, on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku had stopped speaking. The fragments had been coming in all afternoon and into the night. Akagi heavily damaged, then silent. Kaga heavily damaged, then silent. Soryu hit, then silent. Hiryu still fighting, then no longer fighting. By midnight, he understood. His staff officer Watanabe Yasuji, 47 years old, proposed a night surface action. The combined fleet still had 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, dozens of destroyers. If they could close the distance before sunrise, they could engage the American carriers in a gun and torpedo battle where aviation would not matter. Japanese surface gunnery was the finest in the world. Japanese torpedoes were the finest in the world. There was still a chance to salvage something. Chief planner Kuroshima Kamito, 49 years old, did the geometry on the chart table. The Yamato could make 27 knots. The American carriers, if they chose to withdraw to the east, could make 30. The Japanese fleet could not catch them. Not before dawn, and in daylight without air cover, the Yamato and her sisters would be exactly what their builders had refused to admit they were: targets. Across the table, Rear Admiral Ugaki Matomi, 52 years old, the chief of staff of the combined fleet, recorded the moment in his diary. The diary, called Sensoraku, would survive the war and the death of its author and be published decades later. The entry for that night is very short. Yamamoto, Ugaki wrote, said almost nothing for several hours. He sat in his cabin alone. He played shogi against himself. An officer gently raised the question that hung in the air, the question of seppuku, the question of suicide as the only honorable response to a defeat of this scale. Yamamoto looked up. The responsibility of apologizing to the emperor, he said, is mine alone. He did not say he would die. He said the opposite. He would live with it. He would carry the weight. In a culture that prized clean death above almost everything, choosing to live with shame was a harder thing. At 2:55 in the morning of June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku gave the order. The Midway operation was cancelled. The combined fleet would withdraw to the west. For the first time since the war began, the Imperial Japanese Navy turned its back on an enemy and ran. The retreat went wrong almost immediately. In the darkness, units of the Japanese invasion screen received fragmentary orders. Two heavy cruisers, the Mogami and the Mikuma, were maneuvering in close formation when an American submarine, the Tambor, was sighted nearby. The cruisers turned hard to evade. In the dark, without running lights, traveling at 28 knots, the Mogami plowed into the port side of the Mikuma. The bow of the Mogami crumpled. The side of the Mikuma split open. Both ships began trailing heavy oil. They limped westward at 12 knots, leaving behind them a dark ribbon across the surface of the ocean. On the morning of June 6th, dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Hornet found them by following the oil. The Mikuma absorbed 5 direct bomb hits. Her decks burned, her ammunition cooked off. By evening, she had rolled over and gone down. Her captain, Sakiyama Shikao, went with her. More than 650 men went down with her. The Mogami took 6 bomb hits and somehow stayed afloat. She limped back to the base at Truk. She would spend more than a year in repair. Japan's second worst loss of the entire battle, after the carriers, had not been inflicted by the enemy. It had been inflicted by Japanese ships running into each other in the dark. The official communiqué was issued on June 10th. It announced a great victory. 2 American carriers sunk. 150 American aircraft destroyed. Imperial losses described as light. The names Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu were not mentioned. The Japanese public never heard the truth. Even the Imperial Army was not told. Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, 57 years old, was kept in the dark about the scale of the loss for months. The Navy considered the disaster an internal matter. The survivors were quarantined. Sailors rescued from the burning carriers were not allowed to write home. They were not allowed home leave. They were transferred directly to remote postings in the South Pacific. Many of them would not survive the next 2 years to tell the story. The cover-up bought Japan nothing. Industry could not catch up to what had been lost. Pilot training could not catch up. The veteran air crews who had hit Pearl Harbor and Ceylon and the Dutch East Indies were gone. Their replacements would arrive at the front with half their flight hours and a fraction of their experience. By the summer of 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American pilots would describe the slaughter of Japanese naval aviation as a turkey shoot. By October of 1944, at Leyte Gulf, the surviving Japanese carriers would be sent into battle as decoys, empty flight decks. No aircraft to launch, floating bait, sailing out to draw American carriers north, so that a Japanese surface force could attempt a last battleship engagement of the war. The trap Yamamoto had drawn at Midway, where carriers would be the killers and battleships the cleanup, had inverted itself completely. Now the carriers were bait, and the battleships were the ones being hunted. The Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered. The men who had stood on the bridges that morning did not recover either. Nagumo Chuichi was quietly demoted. Carrier command was taken from him. He was sent to a land-based naval air command in the Marianas. In July of 1944, as American Marines closed in on his headquarters in a cave on Saipan, Nagumo Chuichi shot himself with a pistol. He was 57 years old. He was found by his aide. He had not chosen the formal ritual of seppuku. He had simply put a service revolver to his temple and pulled the trigger. There are accounts that say his last words spoke of Midway. Those accounts come from a single source and cannot be fully verified. They may be true. They may be the story his men needed him to have told. Yamamoto Isoroku did not survive the war either. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, Yamamoto flew a forward inspection tour of bases in the Solomon Islands. His staff had transmitted his flight itinerary in advance, encrypted in the JN-25 Naval Code. The same code Joseph Rochefort had been reading at Pearl Harbor. A new generation of cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor decrypted the itinerary within hours of its transmission. Admiral Nimitz authorized an interception. 16 P-38 Lightning long-range fighters, led by Major John Mitchell, 28 years old, took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. They flew 400 miles at wave-top altitude in radio silence and arrived over Bougainville at the exact moment Yamamoto's transport descended for landing. The Betty bomber carrying Yamamoto was shot down into the jungle. His body was recovered the next day. He was still strapped into his seat. A bullet had entered through his lower jaw on the left side and exited near his right temple. The same intelligence apparatus that had set the trap at Midway had now closed it on the man who designed Pearl Harbor. The man who made it all possible was forgotten. Joseph Rochefort, after Midway, was the target of a bureaucratic war inside the United States Navy. Senior officers in Washington, the Redman brothers, resented Rochefort's success and the credit it brought to Pearl Harbor over the Central Intelligence offices in Washington. Within months, Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hippo. He was reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. He spent the rest of the war on shore duty. The medal he had been nominated for after Midway, the Distinguished Service Medal, was blocked. For decades, Rochefort died in 1976. 10 years after his death, in 1986, President Ronald Reagan finally awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal, posthumously. His daughter accepted it. By then, almost no one outside the intelligence community remembered who he was. The trap the Japanese admirals realized they had sailed into that morning was not the dive bombers. The dive bombers were the consequence. The trap was older, deeper, and more complete than any of them understood at the time. It was the assumption that the enemy could not be reading their mail. It was the assumption that intelligence work done by a tired man in carpet slippers in a Hawaiian basement could not undo 6 months of victory. It was the assumption that the side with the biggest battleships, the most veteran pilots, the longest carrier decks, and the most aggressive doctrine could not be beaten by a quieter, slower, less glamorous kind of war. It was the assumption that a trap of that elegance could not exist. Nagumo Chuichi understood at 10:25 in the morning. Yamaguchi Tamon understood by sunset. Yamamoto Isoroku understood by midnight. The Empire of Japan would take 3 more years to understand. By then, the carriers were gone. The pilots were gone. The cities were burning. And in a basement office at Pearl Harbor, that no one talked about anymore, the men who had built the trap were already reading the next set of messages. The Pacific War did not end at Midway. It only stopped being winnable.